Do, do, do. Da-da. Boom.
The attitudinal model is another explanation of judicial behavior. It's very popular among political scientists who want to explain why justices on the Supreme Court make the decisions they make. Attitudes are basically opinion that evaluate something. That can be a policy issue with respect to political attitudes. It can be persons. You can have an evaluation of a particular person or group of persons. And attitudes can be about court decision outcomes, whether the minority party should win, whether the government should win, whether somebody claiming freedom of religion should win. All of this can be connected to opinions about what's the right thing. So attitudes can be really applicable to court decisions. Now the attitudinal model uses this idea of attitudes or political opinions to explain why justices make the decisions they make. And it's based on three assumptions. First, if you remember our discussion of the legal model, we found that there are so many different ways to interpret the law that basically every case outcome is possible. And that's the first assumption. Second, Supreme Court justices can make any decision they want to make without real repercussions. There is no serious political oversight. And third, there is the assumption that Supreme Court justices are motivated by their political goals or political attitudes. They want to achieve political outcomes. So what does the attitudinal model do with those three assumptions? Here is how it works. Consider what we call a political space. That's basically a range of different political opinions that enables us to place individuals' opinions as well as political outcomes in a way that they are either more liberal or more conservative. Here I am placing Justice Scalia towards the conservative end of the political spectrum or political space here. Scalia is known to be one of the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court. And here is Justice Ginsburg, a more liberal justice. I placed her towards the left liberal end of the spectrum. Now I've placed a particular issue that actually came up in the Supreme Court into the same political space. The issue is whether a federal law banning partial birth abortions is constitutional or not. We already saw that Roe versus Wade in 1973 created a constitutional right to have an abortion during the first 6 months of pregnancy and also a right to an abortion during the last 3 months of pregnancy, at least in cases in which the health or life of the mother was at risk. Now, partial birth abortion is a type of abortion that's used during the last 3 months typically in situations in which life or health of the pregnant woman is at risk. And it's controversial because it involves the partial birth of the fetus before the abortion. So there are more people than with regular abortions who say that goes beyond abortion and is more the killing of a born person. So as a result, this issue is not clear-cut liberal or clear-cut conservative, but somewhere in between. Now the attitudinal model predicts that a conservative justice like Justice Scalia will vote to uphold the law. Scalia, or a conservative, basically will make a conservative decisions in all cases that are located to his or her left on the political scale. A liberal justice, like Justice Ginsburg, for example, would be predicted by the attitudinal model to overturn the law. According to the attitudinal model, justices make liberal decisions in cases located to their right. They basically say this case is too conservative, I'll make a liberal decision. So Justice Ginsburg would vote to overturn the ban on partial birth abortions. While it is comparatively easy to make a prediction with the attitudinal model for liberal and conservative justices, it's more difficult for justices that are moderate, that are somewhere in between the two liberal and conservative positions. An example would be Justice Kennedy, who right now is the justice in the center of the Supreme Court, and he often strikes the balance. If he decides to go with a conservative decision, the court will make a conservative decision in ideological cases. If Kennedy decides to make a liberal decision, the court often goes the liberal way. Now, the example that I gave you is an actual case that was decided a few years ago. It's Gonzalez versus Carhart, and I let you check on your own how Kennedy actually decided in that case. Look it up on oyes.org. Here's another case. In that case, a murderer was convicted of the murder, but then challenged the conviction because he said it was unfair because during the trial the victims' families were permitted to wear buttons with pictures of the victim, and that influenced the jury against the murderer. Now, that position in the context of court cases would be considered to be so liberal that only extremely liberal justices would agree with the murderer. And in this case, which was a case from 2006, again you can look it up on Oyer, all justices agreed to vote against the murderer. So that case was located to the left even of the more liberal justices on the Supreme Court, and everybody decided to make a conservative decision here. Now again, the attitudinal model can explain this as well by looking at the relationship between the political or ideological position of the justices and the ideological position of the case itself actually. So what this means is, and that's kind of interesting, the attitudinal model doesn't say that all liberal justices always make liberal decisions or all conservative justices always make conservative decisions, but instead the attitudinal model says it really depends on what case they are dealing with. With some cases they clearly split up liberal versus conservative. With other cases they may very well agree with each other. So what's the evidence for the attitudinal model to be a useful, maybe even correct explanation for why Supreme Court justices make the decisions they make? Well, one type of evidence is based on ideological consistency. We find that in cases that are ideologically divisive, the same justices tend to make nowadays conservative decisions, and the same justices tend to make liberal decisions. So Justices Kennedy, Chief Justice Roberts, and Justices Scalia, Alito, and Thomas usually end up on the conservative side of the case. Justices Ginsburg, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Breyer tend to end up on the liberal side of the case. Now there are always exceptions, but this lineup is most common in cases that are clearly politically divisive. So that's evidence for the argument that political attitudes, ideology, actually influences the decision-making of the Supreme Court justices. Another piece of evidence that supports the attitudinal model is the fact that other measures of justices' political ideologies are actually correlated with how the justices vote in cases. This graph is an example of such a situation or such a finding. It's from a 1989 paper, and on the horizontal axis or x-axis of the graph, what's listed there is basically a measure of Supreme Court justice ideology that's based on whether newspaper editorials say that the justices are liberal or conservative. So basically, if a justice gets a 40 on this scale, it means that 40% of newspaper editorials say this justice is a liberal. So the justices that are listed further to the right are more liberal. And the vertical axis, the y-axis, lists the percentage of civil liberties cases in which the justices were supportive of civil liberties. Civil liberties are things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right of people accused of crimes to get evidence excluded because it was unconstitutionally obtained, etc. So a higher percentage of civil liberties support is a good indicator of liberal decision-making patterns. And we see that most justices, those are the dots in the middle of the graph, are located close to the upwards diagonal, which means as the newspaper editorials indicate they're more liberal, their decision-making patterns are actually more liberal. And that's a piece of evidence that decision-making actually does follow patterns that a regular person would say, yes, that's liberal, or yes, that's conservative. So ideology or attitudes seem to matter in decision-making.